Welcome to HIH 2016, History of Pennsylvania, or America in a Nutshell, as we're calling it now. Lecture 16, Industry, World War I and World War II. And we'll really be talking about the relationship between industrial life and industrial output in Pennsylvania and the efforts to supply both equipment and manpower to the First and Second World Wars. If you have a look at the left here, you'll see here on this slide a poster advertising the sale of war bonds. The United States marketed war bonds as a way to finance both the First and Second World War. And so it's a little bit funny to think, but there's a very kind of capitalist-style marketing campaign running rampant across America, particularly in the most populous states and commonwealths like Pennsylvania, trying to get people to invest in war bonds, see a modest return after the war, at the same time that the U.S. is fighting abroad. On the right-hand side of this first slide, you'll see here some graphs indicating, with respect to World War II, industrial output of steel at the beginning and at the end of World War II, or at least the beginning and the end from a U.S. point of view. If you'll note here, you have Pittsburgh here, which is the highest column, the largest steel producer in the United States in terms of a single city. But also, though it's a little bit hard to see, you have here Erie, Pennsylvania, and down here you have Philadelphia. And if you were to put all three of these together, you'll find that as a single state or commonwealth, Pennsylvania outstrips every other state in the Union for production. So I'm going to focus on the growth of the steel industry in and around Pittsburgh, this most important of all American centers of iron and later steel production. So we'll follow the trajectory of industrial output up to the First World War in the first part of this lecture. If we look at the city of Pittsburgh, so-called Iron City, USA, as it's sometimes called, it's incorporated first in 1816. Now, Fort Pitt, on the point between the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, had been an important outpost of trade and early urban development in the western part of Pennsylvania since the end of the French and Indian War and the taking of the fort by British troops, together with the assistance of colonial militia. Now, as we discussed in the readings for, I think it was our second seminar, if I recall right, on the role of the Quakers in resolving the French and Indian War, you might remember from there that after Fort Pitt is taken and firm British control is established over that part of the Allegheny and Ohio River Basin, that you see a lot of merchants move over from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to open up shops, and they do quite well for themselves. Now, in the year 1800, there are only about 1,500 people living in Pittsburgh, and by 1859, there are 50,000 people living in Pittsburgh, and that's because of the rapid growth of the city as both an industrial power, but also as a port. And I'll come back to this in just a second here, but you must think of Pennsylvania as spanning access to the Mississippi River. You can put a boat in Pittsburgh on the Ohio River. The Allegheny and Monongahela rivers come together at Pittsburgh to form the Ohio. You can put a boat on the Ohio River and take it all the way down into the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. You could also, if you were in Philadelphia, at the other end, at the east end of the Commonwealth, you could put goods on a boat in the Delaware Basin and take them out to the Atlantic. And so Pennsylvania actually has a port in the east and a port in the west. And of course, in northwest Pennsylvania, the city of Erie, which we will discuss in a future lecture, forms an important port to the Great Lakes. And so Pittsburgh's really kind of uniquely connected to all three main bodies of water: the Great Lakes Basin, the Mississippi Basin, and the Atlantic Ocean. But Pittsburgh is a port at the same time that it's a major industrial center. So don't think of it as an isolated inland place. Think of it as a riverine port. Now, in 1834, the Pennsylvania Main Line of Public Works opens, and that connects in a far more efficient fashion than the old road network had Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. And so it creates a linkage between these two great urban and industrial centers of Pennsylvania. In 1835, McClurg Manufacturing makes the first locomotive west of the Appalachians. And this is kind of a sign of things to come, that already by the 1830s, there is sufficient expertise, manufacturing skill, sufficient number of machines and raw materials available in Pittsburgh to start manufacturing locomotives, which are really the kind of high-tech major manufactured good of the day. We might think of a locomotive works in the early 19th century as equivalent to setting up a fully automated plant that manufactures automobiles today, for example. So that's really saying something to begin the manufacturing of locomotives in the Pittsburgh area. By 1840, the Pennsylvania Turnpike Road also links Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and the Turnpike is a toll road between these two great urban centers, and the income from the tolls means that you can reinvest in the road and over a reasonably small number of years, over 5 or 10 years, develop what were a series of kind of muddy, winding tracks into quite a substantial road between those two urban centers. In 1845, there are already vast shanty towns in and around Pittsburgh. And if you think about this rate of growth over the 59 years from 1800 to 1859, the city grows by nearly four times what it had been 60 years before. The building of good, substantial housing can't keep up with that. And so that leads to these kind of vast shanty towns, which catch fire predictably in 1845. And the so-called Great Fire of Pittsburgh burns over 1,000 buildings. A lot of these are quite small. Don't picture sort of huge 5-story urban buildings burning. Picture a lot of kind of 2 or 3 room shacks that are being slowly built up into wooden houses catching fire. Still, this creates a real crisis in the city's history. By 1854, the Pennsylvania Railroad has bought up the Pennsylvania Main Line Public Works. It's knocked the railway over the Allegheny Ridge, or through the Allegheny Ridge, via the Horseshoe Bend and the Glantz Tunnels, and you can now take a railroad carriage all the way from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. And more importantly, for the burgeoning manufacturing base of Pittsburgh, you can now put heavy iron and later steel onto railway carriages and move it efficiently and relatively cheaply to the east side of the Commonwealth. By 1857, there are 939 factories in and around Pittsburgh and what's called Allegheny County, which takes in the city itself and the nearby river basins of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and combined Ohio rivers. These are consuming annually 22 million bushels of coal and producing around 27,000 tons of iron. And I come back here to this point about thinking of Pittsburgh as a port because it connects via the Ohio River to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico and all points in between. By tonnage shipped, keep in mind this is by weight, and Pittsburgh's main manufactured good is steel or iron, which is very heavy. But by tonnage, Pittsburgh is the 3rd busiest port in the United States of America, behind New York City as the busiest port in the northeast, and New Orleans as the second busiest port in the what is then the southwest of developed America. Now, how does this radical transformation happen, this radical increase in industrial output? Well, some key technologies come to Pittsburgh. Puddling technology is the most important one. And I'll walk you through this a little bit here. Pittsburgh originally had relied upon using charcoal to create blooms of iron. So they'd cut down vast swathes of forest, of which there seemed at that time a unlimited amount in the early 19th century. Burn it in the absence of oxygen to produce charcoal briquettes, and use that to smelt locally available iron ore. But that process is slowed down a little bit by the fact that charcoal doesn't burn that hot compared to anthracite coal, for example. And there's a lot of work involved in creating the charcoal, transporting it. It's kind of limiting production. But there's a kind of real boom when coal hits the market, and they start mining coal in reasonable proximity to Pittsburgh. So now you have riverine transport, and you have the iron ore, and you have the coal to smelt it efficiently with. You get some real increase in production. So in puddling technology, coal is effectively used to produce iron bars as opposed to blooms. Blooms used to be where you'd kind of have a vat, and you would put the iron ore in the bottom of the vat, and you would build a very hot fire over and around it. You'd poke a hole in the bottom of the vat, and the iron pours out the bottom, leaving the slag at the top. So you get a kind of bloom of iron. The puddling technology actually allows you to pour iron bars, and this. So rather than ending up with a kind of misshaped lump that you then have to work a great deal to get it into a useful shape, puddling allows you to sort of produce a bar-shaped iron that you can do all kinds of things with straight away. One of the things you do is to roll that iron while it's hot to get out, to align the cooling sort of crystalline structure of the iron, to give it a degree of flexibility as well as rigidity, which is important to remove imperfections. Thomas C. Lewis had worked in a Welsh rolling mill, and he's key, in fact, in bringing this new technology to Pittsburgh, these productive processes. The Plumstock plant rolls bars from 1817. And this is a plant which is set up using Lewis's knowledge, and it's the first place in America to roll bars. So first you have to have the puddling technology to produce bar form iron, and then you have to understand the importance of heating it, rolling it, and working out the imperfections. Christopher Cohen, an Englishman, builds the first Pittsburgh rolling mill, which is a place that just focuses on rolling and finishing steel. And so you see we're starting to get layers of technical expertise leaning on each other here. And there's, in fact, a pattern of British knowledge imported to Pennsylvania. And of course, it would be Andrew Carnegie, who would become, by the end of the 19th century, the huge steel magnate of America. And of course, he's a Scot, who again comes with some knowledge and helps grow the industry. Iron City, USA becomes Steel City, USA. That's to say, Pittsburgh's nickname progresses with the technology. So again, we're talking about Pittsburgh here. In Pittsburgh, or Steel City, USA, as it's being called by the end of the 19th century, we see the evolution of the so-called Bessemer process. In 1875, the Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, and yes, that is named after Braddock, the British commander who's so terribly defeated in the first attempt to knock the French out of what would become Pittsburgh. So the Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock begin to use the so-called Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process decarbonizes steel using refractory lines converter to mass-produce steel from pig iron. So these kind of refractory lines are about aligning the kind of crystalline structure of the iron so as to produce a more flexible, and in fact, in terms of iron versus steel, the flexibility of steel that allows it to move slightly without cracking or breaking whilst retaining most of its strength is incredibly important. And so pig iron can be converted through the Bessemer process to steel. And in fact, the brittleness of iron comes from having too much carbon in it, which makes it too crystalline. And pulling some of that carbon out through the Bessemer process produces the more desirable, slightly flexible product of steel. By the end of the United States Civil War in 1865, more than 50% United States steel and more than 30% of United States glass is made in Pittsburgh, because in much the same way the kind of technology of how to efficiently build apparatus for smelting iron ore into iron and then steel emerges in Pittsburgh, you also see a kind of cross-pollination of ideas here where people say, okay, that's great smelting technology. Let's use that to effectively smelt sand into glass. So you melt sand to produce glass. And so there's a close relationship between these two industries, which are both based on taking a mineral, whether it be iron ore or sand, and melting it to produce a liquid which can then be formed into the various sort of shapes you want and purified. Pittsburgh becomes a hub of industrial innovation. The world's first Ferris wheel is built in Pittsburgh in 1892. And of course, if something is ferrous, that adjective to refer to something as ferrous means that it contains iron. So it's an irony wheel, if you would, if you stop to think about what the word means. So probably no surprise that this first sort of giant metal wheel is produced in Pittsburgh. The first cinema, named the Nickelodeon, opens in Pittsburgh in 1905. The first petrol station in the world, commercial petrol station, opens in Pittsburgh in 1913. The first commercial radio station in the world, KDKA, which is still going, broadcasts from Pittsburgh in 1920. Bingo is which we all know, sort of a bingo as it's a sort of a silly game, but actually has a big commercial role. If you think about these big commercial bingo halls like Mecca Bingo, bingo emerges in Pittsburgh in the 1920s as a kind of diversion for factory workers. All kinds of technical innovations follow. For example, air brakes, as used on railways, are an innovation that comes out of Pittsburgh. Before air brakes, you used to have a brakeman on a railway who would be in a caboose at the back of the railway, and if there was ever a need to suddenly stop, he would have to manually turn a braking wheel on the caboose and then head up the train, in some instances along the roof of the various train carriages, to individually brake carriages. You know, turn on the brakes and carriages. As soon as you have air brakes, you run a line from one end of the train to the other, and you can generate pressure from the loco and apply brakes across the whole length of the train, which is much more efficient and less dangerous for the brakeman, to say the least. So at the top of this slide, you get a panorama of Pittsburgh in 1920, and it's amazing for somewhere that, you know, near enough just 1 century before had only been 1,500 people. 100 years later is one of the most important cities in all of America, and you'll see here the scale of the construction of skyscrapers in Pittsburgh. It's not as big an area as Chicago, but in terms of ambition, skyscrapers per square kilometer, it's not far behind. I've already mentioned Andrew Carnegie, who by 1919 dies probably the richest man in America, and he's from Dunfermline in Scotland. He's part of this wave of British industrialists and entrepreneurs who moved to Pittsburgh to take advantage of the opportunities afforded by this rapidly growing industry. Between 1900 and 1925, roughly 30% of all steel produced in America is Carnegie steel. It's coming out of steel foundries owned by Carnegie, or owned by Carnegie's successors, of course, after 1919. So it's really quite remarkable. And of course, this is just at that point in history, when we see a huge construction boom across America. Keep in mind that the population's kind of trebling in places like Pennsylvania from immigration, and they're simultaneously building huge new buildings, apartment blocks, bridges, infrastructure, railways, all to accommodate that really rapidly growing population up to the First World War. Now, all of this production, smelting-based production in Pittsburgh, whether that be glass or iron or steel, is only really possible because of the availability of coal nearby that can be cheaply produced and rapidly moved to these plants. Pennsylvania has 35 coal fields. Northeast Pennsylvania, around Scranton, which would become the focus of Welsh immigration when immigrants would move from the South Wales coal field to Pennsylvania in the 19th century. Scranton, Pennsylvania is called the so-called coal region. There's about a 33,500 square mile area which has coal beneath the surface in more or less any given place. Keep in mind that area, the coal region of northeast Pennsylvania, is just a little less, is just a little more than a third of the landmass of Wales, to give you some comparison. Welsh miners are important because they, for the most part, can speak English when they get there, and they take up quite prominent roles in the mines in and around Scranton. And there are some Welsh language newspapers and so forth that accompany that immigrant community. They're sometimes seen as getting in roles as sort of mine bosses, where they lord it over other immigrants who don't speak English upon arrival, such as German miners, who also come in large numbers. Keep in mind that today the kind of ethnic composition of Pennsylvania is nearly 1/3 ethnically German. And this wave of German miners are not to be confused with the Pennsylvania Dutch, who had been there in Germantown and in southeast Pennsylvania from the 17th or 18th century. This is a wholly new, in fact, numerically much larger wave of German immigration. The so-called Pittsburgh coal field covers all of southwest Pennsylvania, and it's about 2,000 square miles, so about a quarter of the area of the landmass of Wales. Again, German miners and Eastern European miners are most important in the Pittsburgh coal field, although there are some important Welsh mining communities there as well. There are a few towns east of Pittsburgh, town names that begin with the indicative LLA and Llan place name element. Now, both the Northeast and Pittsburgh coal fields produce quote-unquote hard anthracite coal, which burns much hotter and is much more useful for smelting than sort of lower quality bituminous coal. And for the Bessemer process, which decarbonizes pig iron to make steel, coke is produced from coal. So in the same way that you can increase the heating capacity of wood by burning it in the absence of oxygen to create charcoal, you can take coal and burn it in the absence of oxygen to produce coke, a much hotter burning derivative of coal, and that's used in the Bessemer process. Well, it's just at the height of Pittsburgh's productive power, industrial power, that we see World War I break out. And I give you a very famous, actually one of a series of very famous war bonds adverts drawn by Catalinas, a rather amazing turn-of-the-century artist in Philadelphia. And these are war bonds which Pennsylvanians are being told, to buy so that the state, so that both the United States federal government can afford to carry on fighting, but also in this period, so that the state guard can afford to fight. And I'll come back to that in just a moment here. But I just want to point out, if I move my pointer off of that. The kind of amazing way in which this chap, at a point of obvious desperation, is reaching his hand out in rather 3D fashion straight towards the person looking at the poster, sort of begging you as an individual for help. It's interesting because it's a kind of Pennsylvania's answer to the, was it Lord Kitchener, with the famous poster, of course, where he's recruiting for World War I in Britain, where he points straight at you, kind of commanding you to join the army. But this is a much more kind of softer type of approach, and a lot of Katerlinus's sort of paintings like this have this same element of almost kind of begging you for help. So it's a different approach to seeking aid. On the 28th of January 1915, German-American members of the American Neutrality League in Philadelphia meet in Philadelphia. And I point this out because the United States was reluctant to get involved in World War I, just as it would later be reluctant to get involved in World War II. And there's a real concern, particularly given the very high numbers of German immigrants in important population centers like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, or indeed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a whole, that there might be a kind of fifth column problem with Germans undermining production in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And that's something I'll come back to in a moment. But there's a kind of mood before the United States government decides to get involved in World War I. There's a kind of mood among politicians that actually this is a good chance to capitalize on showing sympathy to the Germans and perhaps ensuring that you have support to get elected next time round after this whole brief war thing's blown over, and you can go back to your German immigrants who have become voters and say, remember how I stood with you at this time of trouble. You also have to remember that given the history of revolution against Britain in 1776, of America fighting against Britain again in the War of 1812, that Britain is still seen by most Americans as the baddie, as the sort of evil imperial power. And so it's not just German Americans who see poor little Germany fighting in World War I against the evil empires of Britain as a kind of worldview. Anyway, the German Neutrality League meets in Philadelphia. Deutschland über alles is sung, which of course would be the World War II anthem in Germany. And Governor Martin Brumbaugh presides over this affair. He's of course a Republican governor. 3 congressmen stand up and make anti-British speeches. And this may sound really shocking, given that the US would soon join the war effort, but you have to, again, think of the long history of the United States and of Philadelphia as being a history in which the British are always the stock baddies. Remember that the British Imperial Army had, of course, occupied Philadelphia for many months during the course of the American Revolution. Well, a little more than 2 years later, in April 1917, the United States enters the war. A Philadelphia mob attacks socialists handing out anti-draft leaflets. Philadelphia authorizes a crackdown on socialists. And keep in mind the kind of Palmer raids under Mitchell Palmer and so forth that are coming down the pike here, as mentioned in the immigration lecture. The Young People's Socialist Party is raided, and there's a... although at this time Germany doesn't really have much to do with socialism in the sense that it's still a kind of imperial power, great power, there's a sense that the kind of poor laboring German class have close associations with socialist movements in the US, and so it's hard for people to understand that Germans back in Germany don't have those same tight associations like some German immigrants in Pennsylvania do. So there's a bit of a kind of a swill of different ideas here, but it's a kind of anti-German / anti-socialist mob in Philadelphia. how the worm has turned since 1915. If we look at Pittsburgh and World War I, by 1917, Pittsburgh was already in war production mode. The U.S. could see the direction things were headed. By 1918, the greater Pittsburgh area, which by 1918 has a city population of about 580,000. So again here, that's 10 times what was there back in the 1850s. So again, an incredible ramping up of population here. The greater Pittsburgh area contains 250 plants employing 500,000 workers. So, of course, the population of the city itself is maybe 500,000. But the greater Pittsburgh area, what's called Allegheny County, which includes areas up the river basins, up the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio basins, including other nearby major cities such as Homestead. In total, these 250 plants in the greater Pittsburgh area employ 500,000 people. Pittsburgh mills produce 80% of U.S. munition steel, 80%. The Pittsburgh area produced 75% of coal used in war production. That's 20 million tons of more coal in 1918 than in 1917. So clearly any idea that German Americans were going to form a... So no fifth column, no revolt by ethnically German workers during the war. Production rolls on and ramps up. Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania industrial supremacy directly contributes to victory. If we look at Pennsylvania's contribution in terms of numbers, about 371,000 Pennsylvanians served in the First World War. As a proportion of the population, that's much lower than served in the Civil War, when I think there's a similar number, about 300,000 Pennsylvanians serve in the Civil War, if I recall, as well. So Pennsylvania's World War I contribution in manpower. Well, about 371,000 Pennsylvanians serve in World War I, not all in a frontline capacity, of course. As a proportion of all people living in the Commonwealth, that's a smaller proportion than served in the Civil War, when I think there's about 300,000 Pennsylvanians serve in the Civil War. Pennsylvanians buy about $3 billion in Liberty and Victory bonds. These are war bonds to finance the war. 75% of military footwear came from Pennsylvania tanneries. Keep in mind, again, tanning as an industrial process in this era is still done with oak bark principally, and it's the vast swathes of forest which, while rapidly being cut down, still exist in good numbers in Pennsylvania that allows Pennsylvania to be a key focus of the tanning industry. You take leather and effectively bury it with wet oak bark to tan in with pre-modern methods. The Remington's Arm Company builds a new factory in Essington, Pennsylvania. 2.2 million rifles are made, pattern 1914 Enfields for the British and pattern 17s for the Americans. That's 75% of those used by U.S. soldiers. Keep in mind that those Enfields built for the British Army end up typically, they're on the Western Front, and there's a good chance if you're a British soldier in World War I trench that your your Enfield was actually built in Pennsylvania, manufactured in Pennsylvania. If we look to Philadelphia and east of the Commonwealth, keep in mind, again, Philadelphia is an important port on the Delaware, and it's a major port of embarkation. As of the 19th of March 1917, women could be war nurses. And in fact, in Philadelphia, there's quite a movement for women to become war nurses. They can see the ships going out, and the hospital ships inclusive, and they join up. Loretta Perfectus Walsh of Philadelphia, 21 years old, is the first woman to enlist in the United States Navy as a nurse under this new rule. And she's one of many, many thousands follow her between the First and Second World War. Hog Island Shipyard, Philadelphia, completes 40% of America's wartime shipbuilding. At its peak, Hog Island employs some 30,000 workers and launches a vessel every 5.5 days. And this kind of list of contributions from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania could go on and on and on. Those fighting men who go to France, particularly the 28th Division, do see combat. I'll just focus on the 28th in particular here. The 28th lands in France in May 1918. They reinforce British and French versus the Germans in the spring offensive. So this is offensive after the Germans have defeated the Russians. They of course shift in a last desperate attempt to turn things around. They shift loads and loads of thousands and thousands of men to the Western Front. And they get there in time to reinforce the British and French for that onslaught. They fight the Second Battle of the Marne in July to August of 1918. And they end up in the Marne counteroffensive, and they finish the war just at this point. You would look at a map, the Thancourt sector, but that's just where the Swiss, German, and French borders all come together. Now, the 28th Division is, it's about 8%, comprises about 8% of all Pennsylvanians who served in World War I. It sees 14,000 casualties, of whom 2,000 died. And this is of a 20 to 25,000 strong unit. You look at that casualty rate, that's unbelievable. That's a 2/3 casualty rate. They're hailed as heroes. There's a picture of them here on the bottom right. I think that's before they suffer all their casualties in the war. They're known for hand-to-hand combat, and they're called men of iron, and this is a reference to Pittsburgh, actually. A reference to the idea that Pennsylvania is where all the iron comes from, and that these are iron men from Iron City, or Steel City as it's being called by this point. General John Pershing is a U.S. overall commander of forces in the First World War. He calls the 28th Infantry Division his Iron Division. Now, I focus on the 28th here because during the Second World War, they again find themselves in a kind of dicky situation. Now, the interwar period is an interesting one because it's a good example of how governments, really in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, never thought about demobilization. They're keen to mobilize to fight wars, so they never think about the social consequences of demobilization. J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel had launched in 1901, and it becomes the largest, I think it sort of succeeds Carnegie here in the long term. It becomes the largest kind of steel conglomerate in America. And there are labor shortages by 1915, and this is in response to a ramped up war production. During the war, there's a National War Labor Board formed to mediate disputes between workers and the factory owners when it comes to foundries in particular, and it's based in Pittsburgh because the government doesn't want in sort of industrial disputes knocking war production on the head. The War Labor Policies Board sets certain standards on working hours and conditions and pay, which are seen as creating certain guarantees of treatment, preferential treatment compared to the pre-war period. And the problem is, after the war is over, they say, well, we don't need a labor policy board anymore. The war, because it was a war thing, and the war's got over. So in 1918, they pull the plug all of a sudden. After the war, there is no demobilization economy, and so what you see is a sudden slump in contracts, which means a slump in production, which means you don't need all of those laborers that you had working for you in 1917. Now, after the war, yellow dog contracts are phased out, and yellow dog contracts. This is kind of a particular American thing. I don't think that term's used in other contexts. A yellow dog contract is a contract signed by a worker when he's hired, in which he says he will not join a labor union, And there's a real push to try and keep labor unions out insofar as possible, because manufacturers see them as potentially driving up costs if they have to offer union negotiated rights to their workers. But the phasing out of yellow dog contracts, mostly due to resistance from workers, clears the way for high labor union membership. And of course, as always happens at times of economic crisis, people rush to the left and rush to unions and protests as a form of combating what they see as the worst excesses of capitalism, but which might alternatively be interpreted as the natural consequences of capitalism. When demand falls, so supply has to fall, and you don't need all of those workers. But the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, grows rapidly in this period. By the 25th of May 1919, the National Committee of the AFL decides to strike. But they don't really have a war chest yet. They've only really got going and off the ground after the First World War, because for most workers, the AFL kind of replaces the old War Labour Policies Board as the defender of their rights. I mean, a person could debate all day about the efficacy of strikes, whether or not they're really useful, but the reality here is that government buying was really running up the output of manufactories, and so after the war, manufactories just don't need all those workers, and so they either want to cut wages or cut hours or cut the number of workers, because they have to compensate somehow for the fact that they've got a workforce which is bloated compared to what they need. And so in response to this, the AFL tries to sort of show real leadership by striking. The problem is that since they haven't had members paying dues for very long, they really can't afford to pay the strikers much to keep them going. I mean, some of the reasons for striking here, well, there was a stagnant pay, and I mean, no matter how you slice it, working conditions were bad. These are 12-hour days, 6 days a week, without paid holidays in most instances. Around 250,000 men, which is double the actual union membership, strike on a nationwide basis. And of course, this feeds into the so-called Red Scare, and again, I point you back to the immigration lecture and Mitchell Palmer, the fighting Quaker, and the anti-socialist, anti-communist Palmer raids and so forth that would grow out of the Red Scare. The Red Scare comes about against the backdrop of the workers' revolution in Russia. And when you just heard that news about the whole country being turned at its head by this communist revolution, and you see 250,000 men headed out onto the streets to strike, you get scared. Not just if you're an industrialist, but also if you're kind of middle-class person who's worried about having your head on the block at the hands of workers. The manufacturers respond to this by hiring strikebreakers, and of course, African Americans are those which are most likely to be out of work, and they're also those which get laid off and lose their job first because of racism when manufacturers need less workers. But there's a pool of capable African American workers out there, and 30,000 are hired as strikebreakers. Also, because A, strikebreakers are available, and B, the AFL doesn't have much money at its disposal to keep the strikers going financially, the strike collapses. It's a great poster here on the left here announcing how the strike has failed. This is Uncle Sam on the left saying, go back to work. And it's interesting that in American history, the failure of the 1919 strike really is one of these points where America could have become a much more socialist place, perhaps, if this had worked. But the reality is, it doesn't work. And so the crushing defeat of the strikers is seen, somehow written off as well. It was always going to fail because it's anti-American. And And that some of that ideology goes into this publication of the Pittsburgh Chronicle here. You'll see these ugly steelworks in the background. It's Uncle Sam there. But also note how all the languages in which this very practical advert is written, so as to tell workers, a lot of whom clearly don't speak English, that they need to go back to work. This is the third, go back to work here. Russian second, ritornate al lavoro is Italian there. The fourth one there, wracaj do pracy, that's Polish, and it goes on and on down the list. It speaks to the kind of rapid population increase driven by European migrants and the many languages being spoken in the workplace. There's an interwar period. The broader interwar period is one in which industry struggles, not just because of demobilization after the war, but also because of competition. Coal, textiles, and agriculture are seen as a kind of sick trio, a trio of sick men. Efficiency is doing away with the need for quite so much coal. Agriculture, Pennsylvania is struggling to compete against particularly the grain production of the Midwest, which is growing grain at vast scales and the flat plains on 600 or 700 acre farms as opposed to kind of 70 to 100 acre farms back in Pennsylvania. And the textile industry is starting to suffer against competition from cheaper producers elsewhere in America. If I look just here at coal, Pennsylvania in 1917 produces 100 million tons of anthracite with 180,000 miners. It produces 25% less in 1929, so that's 74 million tons of anthracite with 151,000 miners. The value of coal, though, drops by as much as 50%, and so wages sag by as much as 50%. It was normal in this period that if you were in an industry that produced a product, and the value of that product on the open market fell, then workers' wages fell with it. Now, to us today, that might seem sort of bonkers, right? But you've got to remember, most people working in industry then were only one or at best two generations removed from farming. And if you're living on a farm and you grow wheat, say, if you produce, 10 ton of wheat and it sells at, price X, and the next year you produce the same 10 ton and it sells for half of that, then you as a farmer only get half as much income. And you just accept that. That's part and parcel of farming, that you're subject to the market. And so that same mentality travels with workers into the workplace. And they might not like it, but they say, oh, well, you're not growing wheat here, producing coal. Since the value of coal falls by half, your wages are going to have to fall by half because, the company's only taking in half the income. Today, what would happen is you wouldn't be allowed to cut wages, and so if you had 100 workers, you would lay 50 off. In those days, you'd have kept the whole 100 workers, but you'd paid each one half as much after the drop. It's hard to say which is better. Is it better to have 100 people working half-time, or is it better to keep 50 full-time and sack the other 50, which is what we do now? I think that's a little bit of an open question. In terms of textiles, wages are 20 to 60% lower in the impoverished South. And so what we're seeing here is, and that's the southern states of the United States. And so what we're seeing here is a kind of long-term impact of Reconstruction in the South of the United States, where the poverty of the South is being seen as an opportunity by northern industrialists to move their factories down there and cut overheads. Normalizing female work in World War I radically expands the labor pool. World War I is an important point at which more women enter the workforce in lighter industries such as cloth production. It's not just in World War II that we see the kind of Rosie the Riveter type of woman at work character, but we see it in World War I. The difference is after World War I, women more or less are pushed back into the household sphere, whereas after World War II, of course, that really is less strongly felt by women, and more women on a relative basis stay in the workforce after World War II than they had stayed after World War I. Now, if we turn to Pennsylvania politics in the interwar period, I want you to recall that between 1861 and 1935, there had only been one Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, and that was Pattison back in the 1890s. What you see here are Governor Pinchot and Fisher. These are the last two of that very long and almost uninterrupted line of Republican governors. And both of them grapple with how to keep society ticking over in the interwar period, when we see, on a relative basis, a lot of social change due to progressivism and a lot of economic economic growth up to 1929, and then collapse between 29 and 35. So Pinchot has two terms interrupted by Fisher in the middle. This is really a kind of the machine wobbling here between who the machine, Republican machine, thinks is going to be the better man. Pinchot tries to maintain the old Republican line of free markets and industry, called by some, the old deal. But he has to give way to some progressive ideas. And this is a little bit like when you see sort of protests in some country that's a dictatorship, and they think, oh, if we give them a few concessions, the protesters be happy. But in fact, when you give them a few concessions, they think, blimey, if we protest twice as much, we'll get twice as many concessions. So you see the kind of old deal, big business Republicans that say, if business is good, then you'll have a good job. So support free markets and business. Those old deal Republicans have to give way to these progressive ideas of Keynesian economics, at least a little bit. Keynesian economics is this idea, of course, that the government can spend its way out of any crisis by, say, paying person A to dig a hole and paying person B to fill it in. Back and forth, back and forth. And each time that money changes hands, the government takes a little bit back in tax, until eventually the government has reclaimed all the money, and it pays two other men to start digging a hole and filling it in turn. Some people still cling to Keynesian economics. Economists are kind of torn as to how useful Keynesian economics are. It can work to an extent. In the short term, Keynesian economics, with economic stimulus, as we'd call it now, can help. In the long term, if you don't have a solid manufacturing basis, Keynesian economics will basically make you into Venezuela, which is to say, an economic meltdown and collapse. I think people now, most modern economists say, a bit of good old-fashioned supply and demand, free market economics, or maybe more accurately, a foundation of supply and demand, free market economics, sprinkled with some Keynesian economics to help people who can't otherwise get a job, is the kind of social democratic mix. It's what we see in most Western Europe now. Pinchot reformed Pennsylvania. He groups 139 state agencies into 15 departments. And Pinchot tries to sort of clean up the image as part of the progressive movement. Remember, progressivism calls out corruption. He tries to give the appearance of cleaning up the messy administration of pork barrel Pennsylvania politics. Pork barrel politics are, of course, where you kind of give away extra lumps of money here and there to keep things ticking over in an unethical fashion. Each of these 15 departments has a budget which has to be approved with the state legislature. Prohibition law, the United States-wide ban of alcohol, comes in 1920, and Pinchot tries vigorously to enforce it. In Pittsburgh, there's a huge hub of bootlegging. Like the rest of America, attempts to ban alcohol were jokingly ineffective, laughably ineffective. Pinchot mediates in a minor strike in 1923, and part of the resolution that comes out of that strike, less significant than the previous, is an agreement that there should be 8-hour days and a 10% pay rise. But that kind of agreement can be meant in 1923 because most of the workers that were excess to the needs of post-war reproduction had been shed between 1919 and 23 anyway. Governor Fisher experiments with Keynesian economics, and he's sometimes called Fisher the Builder. He spends $235 million on highways, 39 million on public buildings, and 5 million on land for public use, for parks and so forth. My own grandfather was involved in building a what's called, I should say, this building program. When Pinshaw returns from 31 to 35, he carries on with that building program, and he builds even more roads. They're called, in colloquial speech, they're called Pinshaw roads. My own grandfather was involved in building a Pinshaw road, the one that runs through my village, basically. He was involved in tarmacking it. You know, these provide work for a lot of the poorest of Pennsylvanians. Keep in mind the stock market had crashed in 1929, and so unemployment was at unbelievable levels, you know, as much as 25% in a lot of places. And so something needed to be done to give the poorest, most vulnerable a helping hand, and it was thought that the best way to give them a helping hand was to give them a job. Now, that's very different from the democratic approach, which is to give them free stuff so that they basically can sit at home and weather the storm and then go get a job off their own back somewhere else. Two very different approaches to the problem. In the 2008 economic crisis, China, for example, decided to deal with the crisis by employing thousands, I think over 200,000 workers to basically build roads, railways, bridges, and infrastructure, which benefits the state in the long run, whilst the response in many parts of the West was to just plow money into social welfare programs. And so these different responses to crisis are still there. But the Pinshaw and Fisher response was to give people jobs by building infrastructure that would benefit the Commonwealth in the long run. A little bit of Depression context here. It's the 29th of October on 1929 is that black day when the stock market crashes. Farm prices fall 50%. Pennsylvania textile output drops precipitously. Employers of all kinds see their wages cut. Again, it's this idea that, you know, if products are selling for less, the workers should get paid less. Shanty towns grow up, especially in Pittsburgh, where there are a lot of unemployed industrial laborers. These are sometimes called Hoovervilles, because Herbert Hoover was president of the United States. Per capita income falls from $775 in 1929 to $421 in 1933, so precipitous decline. And it's on the back of this that Pinshaw would lose the 1934 election to a new governor, George Early, who becomes only the second Democratic governor between 1861 and 1935. I give you a good quote here. The Republican Party must go progressive or stay bust. The American people are sick of the old deal. And that's if I recall, that's Pinshaw talking there, I think, in his losing election campaign in 1934. And he loses off to George Early, who offers what's called the Little New Deal. And this is because nationally, Roosevelt, the President of the United States, had offered something called the New Deal for all of America. And George Early said, well, we're going to repackage that. We're going to have a little New Deal for Pennsylvania. And it's a lot of free money, basically, which is a term we use to describe money that's just given to you for your own needs in some way, rather than given to you as wages to do a job. If you think here about Pinshaw roads being built by workers funded by the state, that's not free money. You're being given a job and you're earning that money from the state. Free money is money that you're given, say, as some kind of a benefit, you know, welfare benefit, then you decide how you spend it, and you don't have to you don't have to work for it, you don't have to pay it back. So it's a very different thing. The Depression revitalized the Democratic Party, as is true of all modern politics, of course. When there's an economic crisis, everybody rushes radically to the left end of the political spectrum, looking for some help, you know, some kind of free money, as we say. Robert Vann, editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, the United States leading black weekly, he can look out his window in Pittsburgh and see that African Americans, as I've said several times, are due to the kind of innate racism of factory owners, are always the first persons laid off when there's an economic crisis, and so therefore they're the most vulnerable and most affected by economic depression. And so seeing that, Robert Vann is a very influential man. He says in the Pittsburgh Courier, "Go home and turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. The debt has been paid in full." What this refers to is the fact that since the Civil War in 1865, the Democratic Party had been a white supremacist party who had tried to hold down blacks in America. You can think of segregation in the South in America, which was a Democratic Party policy until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And so blacks had always voted Republican. 80–90% voted Republican because the Republican Party was the party that had liberated them from slavery, and the Democratic Party was the party that wanted to put them back into slavery. Robert Vann clocks the fact that when there's economic depression, blacks suffer more than anyone else. And so if you have a Democratic gubernatorial candidate, George Early, promising to offer free money to help out the most vulnerable, that you need to take advantage of that. Forget, what's happened. You forget what happened 90 years ago with slavery. You have to move on and support the people that will help you in the short term. And that's why he says, go home and turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. The debt has been paid in full. There's another little side note that it used to be normal, actually. It was very common. For Lincoln was almost worshipped to a certain degree by freed slaves, who often did have a portrait of Lincoln and really revered him as a kind of visionary man who had ended slavery. Poor whites, too, sought more help during the Depression era, and the Democrats were offering free money. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act is supplemented in Pennsylvania under George Early's Little New Deal. Public assistance and workmen's compensation for injured workers is rolled out. The Democrats ran on a national New Deal ticket, and Early just mirrored it with a Little New Deal ticket. So Democrats are plugging Pennsylvania politics into the national politics of the United States in a way that had really never happened before. Republicans had limited free health care and offered limited free health care and passed by a $250 million offer of federal relief funds because Republicans in Pennsylvania had always wanted to maintain the independence of the Commonwealth. And when the United States federal government offered aid to Pennsylvania, other states, they always do it by offering aid with certain strings attached, which means, yes, you can have X million to help the poor in your state, but in return, you have to give the federal government control over this or that aspect of Commonwealth government. And Republicans had always fiercely resisted entering into any agreement with the federal government that took away from the independence of the Commonwealth. Again, you have to think in this period still, the United States sees itself, and states within the United States see themselves as much more like states in the European Union than parts of a federal country. So Republicans had, in the run-up to this election, raised business taxes and built toll roads to get the money to help the poor. George Early says, heck with that, we're going to take the federal money if we can get it. We're going to call also for $250 million in new taxes on the wealthiest portion of society to give that money as free money to the poorest. This is called by Republicans unwarranted class legislation and decried as un-Pennsylvanian and un-Americans. And the Democrats call it the most constructive, liberal, and humane act in generations. And so you can see the kind of emergence of diametrically opposed economic visions for the Commonwealth. During World War II, war orders for goods go back out to industrialists. Industrial recovery happens. There's a National Industrial Recovery Act that passed in 1933. National labour regulations are put in place, the Wagner Act in 1935. And then when 1939 comes and war breaks out, business goes to town again. 1939, Governor Arthur Horace, who was succeeded early as a Republican, the kind of Democratic spanner in the Republican machine, only lasted for a term with Early. Horace James comes in. He's elected in 1939. He promises to cut those new taxes that Early ramped up, which it had shocked a lot of Pennsylvanians who'd never had much tax before. He cuts aid from $120 million to $60 million per year, and he introduces an Eat to Work Act, which is, again, it's not free money, but instead I'll give you a job and pay you for doing that job. So it's the other vision of how to help people. The Republicans want to give people a job. The Democrats want to give people free money. Thus the Eat to Work Act, which really should be called the Work to Eat Act. There's a Department of Commerce for the Commonwealth created for the first time. There's deregulated employers. 1941 Bethlehem steel strike. The state police are called in, and picketers, when it gets violent, some picketers in fact shot. But this all can happen because war production must come first. And there's a feeling that the vulnerability of the country in wartime gives really unscrupulous labor leaders a way to sort of ransom the nation, and the government feels it can't risk letting that carry on. War production must be secure. Bethlehem Steel, Republic, Inland, Youngstown, Sheet and Tube, collectively known as Little Steel, are a group of manufacturers that had not yet been reorganized into unions in the way that big manufacturers like U.S. Steel had been. And there's an effort to try and use strikes to unionize those shops. Franklin Roosevelt famously says, "A plague on both your houses," when he refers to Republican Pennsylvania governors, and on the one hand, and union leaders and strikers on the other hand. And you'll see there's a good cartoon, the top right here, which shows Franklin Roosevelt taking his hands off and saying, you know, you sort yourself out in Pennsylvania. In numbers, in World War II, 1.25 million serve out of 18 million men in the United States Army. That's a remarkable percentage if you think about the 50 states of the Union. 33,000 die of out of the 419,000 war dead. So that's kind of over the odds in terms of mortalities. 32 won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and that's more than were awarded to persons from any other state. There are 10 million Pennsylvanians in 1940. The U.S. population is 132 million. And so you can see in the context of that, the disproportionate contribution, if you look at these numbers, made by Pennsylvanians to the war effort in terms of numbers. The UK population, for example, is about 48 million, so about 5 times as big as Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a big place. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania alone had a population more or less equal to the population of Canada, and about 4 times the size of the population of Wales. So I hope that gives you some perspective there, why the war, why Pennsylvania is chucking out 1.25 million soldiers. Well, it's because it's, equal to the entire population of Canada. The 28th Division, again, ends up in the thick of it. The 28th Division are the Pennsylvania National Guard. I think I mentioned that before. And so they're volunteer troops. They, for the most part, they only land in Europe a month and a half after D-Day. And so they think they're going to have it easy. But of course, the troops that landed on D-Day needed rest by then from frontline fighting. And so the 28th ends up being the first division to enter Germany on the 11th September 1944, taking heavy casualties. They're then rested themselves in the Ardennes, and they're caught in the German counteroffensive known as the so-called Battle of the Bulge, and they're nearly wiped out. The Germans, for their for their part, dubbed them the Bloody Bucket, referring to the symbol. You'll see the top right here, the Keystone Commonwealth symbol, which they associate with these soldiers who, while themselves nearly taking heavy casualties, also manage to hold back the German advance, causing a lot of casualties on the side of the Germans. War production in World War II is the third largest. Pennsylvania is the third largest producer of armaments. The Pennsylvania Ordnance Work and Keystone Ordnance Works in Williamsport and Meadville are incredibly important. The works at Meadville produce high explosives. At Letterkenny Ordnance Depot in Chambersburg, there alone they handle 3 million tons of bombs, shells, and ordnance. The Philadelphia Naval Yards increased from 30,000 workers to 70,000 workers between World War I and II. They built 50 vessels, including 3 battleships, 2 cruisers, an aircraft carrier, the USS Valley Forge. They kit out 480 vessels. They build or service 1,210 ships. It's a huge industrial contribution. In Sharon, Pennsylvania, Westinghouse develops the Wakeless electrical torpedo. The Philadelphia Radio Corp helps develop radar, and the iconic American Jeep, you'll see pictured in the bottom right here, is produced by the Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania. And this is just the tip of the iceberg for Pennsylvanians' contribution. There's an industrial boom during the war. Pennsylvania increases its production from 5 billion to 15 billion in industrial output. Non-agricultural employment rises from 2.7 to 3.5 million. A lot of that's women in the workforce. But none of this overturns the sort of difficulties that had been there in the interwar period in terms of long-term decline. Pennsylvania is still the 4th state in the Union in terms of overall industrial output, but it's only 7th in wartime contracts this time around, which is a less significant relative contribution than had been focused in Pennsylvania World War I. All of this work had not equaled sustainable growth. As a percentage of U.S. GDP, Pennsylvania is 1% less in 43 than it had been in 39. 1% is $1 billion in trade. On the bad side, steel continues to buck the trend, but other industries bleed away to the south where labor is cheap, particularly the cloth industries headed out at high speed, textiles. The positive, what does Pennsylvania have going for it? Well, in 1945, to quote Klein and Hugenboom, Pennsylvania was a rich state with vast, diversified manufacturers, splendid natural resources, and a skilled labor force. The question is, would, going forward, the government of the Commonwealth be able to harness those things and turn them into prosperity?